Now that you've heard the Kauffman Foundation's views on the state of entrepreneurship and the Commerce Department's plans to support entrepreneurs, it's time to turn to the subject of the day: how aging baby boomers and rising millennials can renew America's entrepreneurial growth. Moderating today's panel discussion on this topic is Mark Zandi, the chief economist of Moody's Analytics. Mark is an entrepreneur, having co-founded Economy.com, which is now owned by Moody's. He's a renowned economic researcher and author, and serves as a trusted economic advisor to business leaders, policymakers, and the media. Please help me welcome Mark Zandi.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks. Appreciate that. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Kauffman Foundation, for the opportunity. Dane, for the opportunity. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, I'm not just an egghead economist. Yeah, I might look like one. I did start a company with my best friend and my brother in 1990, and we sold it to the Moody's Corporation in late 2005. And in case you're wondering, the financial crisis is not my fault. I had nothing to do with it. We did join Moody's after the deed was done. So, it is my pleasure to be able to participate in this very important forum, and it is important. The economy is performing well. You can just see it in the job statistics. We've created well over 3 million jobs over the past year. That's about as good as it gets. You have to go back to 1999 when entrepreneurship was in full swing for a year like that. In the last 3 months, we created over 1 million jobs. That's boom-like economic growth. So it all feels pretty good, and I think prospects, at least for the near future, are good. But I do think there are things to be nervous about, and the state of entrepreneurship is one of those things. And that's also evident in the data. As Wendy pointed out, we have seen a rather sharp decline in the number of small business formations. No surprise that formations would fall off during the recession, and they did quite substantively. But what is becoming more of a surprise with each passing quarter is the lack of a revival in business formation. Just to give you a statistic from the Business Employment Dynamics Survey, in the year that ended the second quarter of 2014, job gains at establishments that opened during that period was 5.2 million. 5.2 million jobs created in that year at establishments that opened. For context, before the recession in the mid-2000s, we typically saw annual job growth that was well over 6 million. And in the late 90s, at the peak of entrepreneurship and innovation, it was 7 to 7.5 million. So this is a problem. And unless it changes, unless we do see more entrepreneurship, the kind of growth we're getting now cannot continue. It will not continue. So this needs to change. And of course, it's key to change. We have to understand what's going on. And fortunately, we have the Kauffman Foundation leading the way on this, because this is a complex problem. There's lots of different issues involved. Perhaps the long shadow of the recession is still weighing on risk-taking. I'm sure that's the case. Wendy mentioned capital. It's not only debt capital, but equity capital. I mean, you go to Silicon Valley and they say no problem, no problem with entrepreneurship. You go anywhere else in the country, there is no venture capital, and it is a problem. Maybe innovation isn't as strong as it was in times past. There's some evidence of that as well. But I do think another factor playing a role is the topic of today's discussion, and that is demographics. The aging of the population. The boomers are now in their 50s and 60s. I, by the way, represent the largest single-year age group in the country. I am 55. I represent that is the teeth of the baby boom generation. And we are aging, and I can't imagine starting a company at 55, to tell you the truth. That's a heavy lift. But of course, we have the millennials coming, and they're in their 20s and early 30s. And by the way, my firstborn son, is now 24, and he represents the single largest age group among the millennials. So I should have a reality TV show. What I'm doing and my family's doing, the world is doing. We won't go into any more detail on that. But I do think demographics are playing a very key role, and thus the topic of today's discussion. And let me just explain how this is going to work. It feels complicated, but it's not really. When I was given the script, I go, this is really complicated, but it'll work out very well. We have 4 panelists. 2 of the panelists are, I believe, you're millennials, and they're going to be talking about the future of entrepreneurship for the millennial group. We've got someone who's very optimistic about prospects for entrepreneurship among millennials, and someone who's more pessimistic, and they'll give us a sense of that. After they're finished, then we have the 2 congressmen and congresswomen who will be questioning the millennial group. We've got 10 minutes for that, and we'll pepper them with questions and tease out some more information. Then we'll turn to the boomer group. By the way, you'll notice that the boomer group are 2 old white men, sitting over here. One's an optimist and one's a pessimist. And then the congresswomen and congressmen have an opportunity to question them, and then they'll wrap it up, and we'll move forward. Sound okay? Sound like a good game plan? Okay. Before we get to the panel, let me present some survey results that the Kauffman Foundation put together. This is not a. How many of you participated in this survey? Did any of you participate in this survey for Kauffman? Raise your hand. Okay, so this is definitely not a scientific survey. Yeah, it's not a scientific. About 100 survey respondents, and several questions were asked. And I think we have a slide presenting. No slides? Oh, there's no slides. Okay. The first question is of the group, the 100 or so participants. Do you believe the question is, do you believe the millennials will have a greater impact on entrepreneurship or boomers? Bigger impact on entrepreneurship, millennials or boomers? So how many people think millennials? Okay. How many people think boomers? That's about the survey results. So about 2/3. 2/3 said the millennials are going to lead the way. Only 1/3 said the boomers are going to lead the way. And then the question was posed, if you say it's going to be the millennials, what kind of policy can be put forward to help the millennials do better as entrepreneurs? And I'm not sure. It was a pretty close call, so maybe we'll wait till we'll hear from the panelists what they have to say about that. But there was a lot of other responses that people provided, everything from student loan debt to fiscal stimulus to all kinds of things. And then of course there was a set of questions about what kind of policy response should be put into place to help boomers. And I think we'll wait till the panelists to be able to present their ideas, and we'll move forward. Okay, so at this point, let me call the panelists up. Perhaps you could join me up here at the Congressman Delaney and Cabot. And while they're doing that, let me read a couple of other statements from other folks in Congress that couldn't be with us today but wanted to make remarks. The first is from Senator Jerry Moran from Kansas, and this is his remarks to the group. While I regret that I'm unable to be with you in person today, I did not want to miss this opportunity to share my thoughts on the importance of celebrating entrepreneurship. There is perhaps no greater cause worthy of support than the Kauffman Foundation's mission of fostering and promoting entrepreneurship around the globe. Kauffman plays a key role both in helping entrepreneurs realize success and in providing lawmakers with the important data they need to make educated decisions during the policymaking process. The Foundation's research has taught many of my colleagues what most of us have already known to be true. When entrepreneurs succeed, our communities, economy, and nation succeed as well. I firmly believe a startup considerate Congress is apt to produce the smarter policies our country needs, and I'm incredibly grateful to the Kauffman Foundation for being an invaluable ally in my efforts to promote entrepreneurship in Washington. In 2011, I came across Kauffman research on ways to stimulate new business formation and expansion by reducing the barriers that stand in the way of entrepreneurs finding success, from an arcane tax code and burdensome regulatory environment to limited access to capital in the global battle for talent. That research ultimately led to legislation called the Startup Act, which I recently reintroduced in the 114th Congress with strong bipartisan support. But the Kauffman Foundation doesn't just do research. They are active participants in the startup community through their many programs around the globe. I want to thank the foundation for its endless pursuit of a better world on behalf of both the entrepreneurs that will build it and the future generations it will impact. I join you today in recognizing and celebrating the innovators who make such a powerful contribution to our economy and send my best wishes for a successful State of Entrepreneurship event. So that's from Senator Jerry Moran of Congress. And we also have one other statement from Congressman Steve Chabot from Ohio. He's the chairman of the House Small Business Committee. And this is his statement. To the Kauffman Foundation and all those gathered here today, I regret that I was unable to join you for this important event. As everyone in this room knows, entrepreneurship and free enterprise represent the essence of the American idea, offering anyone with a vision and the willingness to commit the time and energy to turn that vision into a reality, the opportunity to succeed in America. As chairman of the Small Business Committee, I will be focusing my time and energy on ways to alleviate barriers for entrepreneurs so they can experience more growth and more success, and I look forward to working with those in this room towards that goal. I want to thank the Kauffman Foundation for all that it does to inform policymakers and promote the benefits of starting new businesses. It was Mark Cuban that said, quote, "It's not in the dreaming, it's in the doing," unquote. In a town oversaturated with rhetoric and hot air, not in this room, it is always refreshing to look towards the community of doers for inspiration. Keep up the good work. Great. So let me introduce the panelists. Let me begin with the Millennials. The optimist is Shaila Itachuriya. Shaila is the co-founder and CEO of Institute. You want to explain what Institute is?
Yeah, we're bringing back apprenticeships for 21st century careers, putting young adults under founders and CEOs at fast-growing, innovative companies.
Great. And you also worked at Birchbox, which I understand is good timing for me to learn what that is because Valentine's Day is coming. Yeah. So if anyone doesn't know what Birchbox is, that's important. And you're an Echoing Green Fellow. And what is that?
It's a fellowship that awards social entrepreneurs through a 2-year stipend program.
Fantastic. And the negative millennial, I'm not sure what that's all about, but Aparna Mathur, she's a resident scholar from the American Enterprise Institute and also teaches at Georgetown, publishes in many scholarly journals and is often quoted in the media. And your major area of research today is, what are you working on mostly these days?
Well, economic mobility, income inequality issues, and now millennials.
Millennials, okay. Now the boomers, the gray-haired guys. At least you have hair. Yeah, right. We've got Chris Farrell. Chris and I go way back. When I first started my company, he was actually instrumental in allowing me to gain a voice. He was you were probably the chief economics correspondent at Business Week at the time. And I was recounting a story with Chris that he was asking me, this was when the defense industry was building down, and so we were trying to estimate the impact on the economy of this, and I got the budget accounting all wrong, and it was really a disaster. But I learned from that experience. I now know budget accounting very, very well because of that. And, yeah, and Chris has a new book on retirement. It's you want to tell us what the book's about, Chris?
It's about the economics. It's the positive economics effect of an aging population.
Great, good. And Bill Galston from Brookings, senior fellow there, also teaches at the University of Maryland. You're a former advisor to President Clinton. Yeah, what did you advise him on?
Domestic policy.
Domestic policy, okay. That all worked out pretty well, didn't it? Yeah, job growth, yeah.
The American people certainly think so.
And Bill also, Bill is the author of 8 books, and he wants to tell us about all 8. Okay, all right, very good. And we're joined by 2 folks from Congress, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, who, as Wendy said, chairs the Future Caucus, which is focused on advancing competitiveness and innovation. And we don't know what kind of business you worked in, Congresswoman.
My parents are teachers by training, and were teaching back in American Samoa, and their first entrepreneurial endeavor was opening a sports shop because they both loved to play tennis. Their first date was on a tennis court. And later on in Hawaii, when I entered the picture, they had a small deli, family-run natural deli. It was a vegetarian family-style cooking deli. And I get to take credit for the name of the restaurant. It's called the Natural Deli because our family sat around the dinner table one night, all of us 5 kids, and we had a competition who could come up with the name of the restaurant, and whoever won would get 1 free meal. I got 1.
That's great. That's great. And we're also joined by Congressman John Delaney from Maryland. Congressman, I didn't realize you started 2 companies that are now traded on the NYSE. Which 2 are those?
Healthcare Financial Partners, which is a company I started in 1993, took public in 1996, and then sold it in 1999. And then my second company was called Capital Source, which started in 2000, took public in 2003.
Fantastic. Yeah, and you were also a Ernst & Young Entrepreneurship Award.
I was, and I just learned that the Kauffman Foundation is a big backer and sponsor of that program, which I wasn't aware of. I should have been, so I want to.
So here's my real question for you, Congressman. You did these 2 companies before your age of 40. What have you done since? Come on.
Entered a very highly functioning body of American legislative prowess.
All right. Okay. All right, I'm going to join the group over here. And I think take it away, Shaila. We'd like to hear your views on the millennials. Yep.
So the term millennial, it's going to be thrown out a lot. It already has. And the funny thing is, it's one of the most vaguely defined terms that's out there. It's basically the stop hold for anything after Generation X, which right now consists of, people say, roughly 15 to 35-year-old individuals. What's interesting is when people say the word, often you have this impression of this fresh face, right out of college, inexperienced youth. But the reality of this population is they represent a large spectrum of experiences, knowledge, firsthand, encounters they have, and skills. And more importantly, over half of them have established experience. I'm one of them. I have 12 years of working history under my belt between 2 large corporations, working at 2 startups, and then started my own company. And I'm not alone. There's many like me. So why does this matter? And why is this relevant to today's conversation? Well, in sheer numbers alone, this force of millennials cannot be ignored. By 2030, this population of people will represent over half of the workforce, and in aggregate, be a size as a group that the US population has never seen before in its history. And more so, they embody a lot of characteristics and strengths that we associate with entrepreneurship. Specifically, if you look at a poll by Bank of America, 82% of millennials responded that they're optimistic and favorable about growth and innovation coming out of their local economies, versus only 40% of that of boomers. Now, some might say, oh, that's just them being youthful naiveness, right? But at the end of the day, isn't that what entrepreneurs are about? That irrational optimism, that unwavering and dogged belief, and an ability to see opportunity when others can't. Now, if you think about all of this kind of combined and what it means, moving forward, I think it's millennials right now who, in this wave of new innovations hitting every day, of new products being launched, are the first to adopt. They're the first to play with it. And then they're also the first to kind of figure out ways to extract value. Now, sure, some of the things they come up with are laughable, questionable, unclear. But the point is, it's not about making everyone win. It's just finding those few grand slams that hit it out of the park. And in the millennial population, you're going to have more people toying and tinkering and playing to effectively get more grand slam potentials. Isn't that what entrepreneurship is all about? Encouraging more people to step up to the plate, to take the swing, and maybe, should they have to deal with strikes, keep swinging and keep fighting to hit it out of the park. And that's where millennials will come in, and that's why they'll be the biggest force driving innovation for the economy. Now, specifically in terms of the policy idea that I presented to the table, it's actually about taking the money that's locked in to federal aid, either grants or loans, and opening it up beyond solely applying to accredited institution. As hinted about earlier, at the current speculations of why entrepreneurship has dropped, a recurring theme is the crippling burden of student loan debt, literally hindering people from doing anything other than just try and make it by to pay it down. And what's crazy is, right now, over $100 billion of federal aid and another $30 billion in Pell Grants a year is only locked in to institutions that have an accreditation status. What's funny is, everyone knows, and yet no one's calling out the fact that most of these institutions have no accountable metrics to which they have to report. While there is structure, a very rigid structure in how they get that status, you ask most of these institutions to report on what type of job placement rates they have, what type of skill development they can actually point to their students getting, whether it's critical thinking, problem solving, reasoning. Majority of institutions fall short. And my policy proposal is just to ask that this locked in funding gets opened up. Right now, we're at this amazing time of a lot of innovative models stepping to the table. Models that already are showing better data points about critical thinking, problem solving, reasoning, skill development, better data points about getting young people into jobs sooner, giving them more experience to actually understand what's going on in the marketplace, and more so, doing this at a significant reduced portion of the total cost of what it costs to go to a traditional 4-year accredited institution.
Great. Well, let me ask you a quick question. So if you look, the data here is pretty thin, but the data that I've seen, and Ruth actually was writing about this from the Wall Street Journal, is that it feels like millennials are starting companies at a much, in being entrepreneurial at a much lower level at this point in their life cycle than previous generations. Does that sound right to you? Does the data sound right to you?
I mean, right's a relative term. I think it's a generation that's being exposed to things at a much younger age and being given tools to allow them to experiment and play. And in sometimes, you could argue, a slightly safe environment to let them play with that. So I'm not surprised.
You're not.
That again, to the analogy of the many swings for the few grand slams, I think we should be encouraging more tinkering, more playing. But I also think the reality is people need experience and firsthand knowledge and understanding of a bigger picture to then figure out all the pieces that come together to execute successful businesses.
Okay.
The pessimist.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not normally.
You're not supposed to smile. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great segue for my talk, which is about experience and about getting the right experience and getting millennials into entrepreneurship. But let me start with the good part. So the good part is millennials, as Wendy mentioned earlier, are one of the most educated generations in history. Fully 34% have at least a college degree. The problem is this hasn't resulted in particularly good outcomes for them in the labor market. If you look at employment for 18 to 29-year-olds, roughly the generation, the age that we're looking at, 37% are unemployed or out of the workforce. As a result, if you see, they've invested a lot in education, they've accumulated student debt, they have credit card debt, but they don't have the ability to pay it off. They don't have the earnings from the labor market to pay it off. About 4 in 10 millennials complain that they have accumulated too much debt and they don't see a prospect for, they're optimistic about the future, but there are no real practical means to pay it off. So a big problem, of course, has been that they're coming out into a labor market which is not the most receptive. It's one of the weakest labor markets that this young generation has faced. And as a result, we're going to see this effect not just for the current generation, but over the lifetimes. Over 15, research suggests that over 15-year periods, the earnings potential will be low and will be going down significantly. So it is no wonder that Pew Research Center studies suggest that a lot of them have either moved back in with their parents or are staying with roommates because they want to cut down costs. Now, it is true that they're very optimistic about the future. So about half to 2/3 of millennials are interested in entrepreneurship, and more than 27% are already self-employed. In fact, in 2011, they started about 160,000 startups, And this is obviously an encouraging trend. This is something that we want to support. But when you actually talk to them, what are the obstacles that you face in starting businesses? A lot of them mention access to capital. A lot of them mention lack of education, the right education to start the businesses, and they mention the lack of experience. Now, from my perspective, I think, getting to my policy idea, I think the big issue is that a lot of them have not gotten the relevant experience. This is while they're in school and also when they come out into the job market. When they come out into the job market, as we said, this is a weak economy. They're not getting hired right away. And I think that's affecting their ability to gain the experience, to gain the expertise that they need to start and run their own businesses, which may also affect their ability to get loans. At the same time, we're not seeing enough investment in apprenticeships, in trainings in school, which will help them gain the expertise and also help them maybe get a job right after college, which will help them to gain the right skill set, to move easily, to transition easily from school to jobs as they're making their way up the education ladder. And so, and this is relevant. So there was a Pew survey which actually asked millennials, what do you most regret about what you didn't do when you were in college? And about 50% said we didn't get the right experience. We didn't get enough work experience. We didn't develop enough skills so that we could translate that into starting our own businesses, into maybe even getting into the right sectors or getting jobs in the right sectors to gain the relevant experience that they need to start their businesses. A Kauffman Foundation poll also found that 92% of millennials support increased access to education and training needed to run a small business as a way to encourage people to become entrepreneurs. Today, there are nearly 6 million young adults nationally who neither work nor go to school. So my policy idea is to bring back more vocational education programs, help prepare youngsters for the job market through better training programs, through apprenticeship programs in partnership with different businesses and industries across the country, across different communities. And similarly for older workers, the older millennials, having more on-the-job training programs that would allow them to develop the skill set that they need to function effectively, to perform well on the jobs. And this could be done through a system of tax credits where the employers are given the right incentives to make those initial investments in training. The advantage of apprenticeship programs is, of course, that it's an earn while you learn system. You're not just, which would help you pay off your debts, which would also help you avoid debts entirely if you're in a program where you're learning all the skills on the job. So for companies, of course, the benefit is that they get a steady stream of tailor-made workers. So from my perspective, these kinds of programs appear to be win-win, ensuring a gateway into a successful and sustainable long-term career. And I feel like we need much more investment in these programs in the US. We lag behind a lot of countries, especially like Germany, where these kinds of programs are much, much more common. So I would really like to see more of that happen in the future.
Great. So why are you the pessimist? Do you think they're doomed?
I feel like we need to push them to get, to be able to attain their dreams. They are an optimistic generation. They want to do a lot, but I think there are lots of obstacles holding them back, and we need to make the right investments to help them.
Well, great. Well, we're at the point where you were giving the congresswoman an opportunity to pose questions, make comments with regard to the millennial position.
For both.
Yeah, either one or both. Yep.
Okay, I'll kick it off here.
Okay.
On the pessimistic side, I think one of the things that I've heard, both from the millennials or students as well as those in the job market, is perhaps it's not the fact that there's not enough training programs or apprenticeship programs out there that are available, but that the bridge is not being connected between the two directly, but also I think the bigger question is, that we have so many college graduates who are unemployed, who aren't getting into the field that they had originally decided to study. And there seems to be a huge disconnect between the educational institutions and the job market and the demands of our economy. And knowing that, how would you propose to be able to connect those two? And then I'll just mention quickly for Shyla, opening up the use of these funds that are locked up, as you say, in a more broad way. I would turn the question back on your original statement of the problem, which is the lack of accountability with the current institutions, educational institutions, of how many people get placed into good paying jobs, et cetera, et cetera. If you open this up so broadly, how can you then also require that accountability of taxpayer dollars?
So you're absolutely right that we are seeing this mismatch. You see survey after survey of employers saying, we have vacancies, we are creating, we want people to come and work for us, but we're not finding people with the right skill set. And I think that's exactly where this kind of proposal would be really helpful, because they can in fact train people at younger ages to develop those skills that they need to perform effectively on the job. So you can keep them in school, but I believe a lot of engineering schools in fact do that they will hire people. You intern with them over the summer. Your internship can actually continue for longer, but you learn the skills that you need to perform well on the job once you get the job. And in fact, you have a job waiting at the end of those programs. So I think bridging the gap is extremely important, and we're not doing that through traditional four-year degrees. That's a big complaint that employers have. But we can do it through more vocational training and through these paid apprenticeship programs where workers can go into a firm, figure out how things work, and be, as you say, day one ready to perform well on the job.
Just to answer my own slant on that, so I'm a little biased because Institute is bringing back apprenticeships for 21st century careers. But what we found is interesting is when you talk, the reason we built this company was because, to the very point, employers are like, I interview kids from the best Ivies, these small community colleges, it doesn't matter. None of them understand, first of all, what we do. Like, they have a marketing degree that means nothing in terms of how we actually market products, but more so, they don't get it. And their quote-unquote internship did very little to teach them what they needed, and both internally what they knew versus maybe where the gaps were. And I think fundamentally, if you look at the higher education conflict in this space, you ask most universities, what value do you offer young adults? And they'll list off a great number of things, but I'll be surprised if career is mentioned in the top 5 responses. You ask most young adults and their families why they go into college, and they will tell you normally top 1, if not top 2, to get a good job. And that disconnect needs to be addressed, and so with Institute, we're trying to do that. So the other question you asked about flipping it on me, love it. There's a lot of things that actually can be measured, and even just in setting up the parameters of what you do to approve giving money to entities. Right now, accreditation agencies look at things like percentage of PhDs as a reflection of total staff, and facility maintenance. Those are some of the criteria they use in defining if an entity should be an accredited university. I would argue the things that should matter: job placement rate, development in critical thinking, problem-solving, reasoning skills, which there are now new tests that have come out. CLA Plus is something our organization uses that tracks that in a very accurate degree, as well as, you could say, retention rates and even just completion of program rates. Those 4 data points already point to such huge gaps in what's happening in the current model, and also open up an opportunity for players who are new, innovative, and cheaper, and maybe a subset come in and step up to play.
Congressman, any?
Yeah, so maybe I'll ask the same question for both the negative and positive bias here, because finding some constructive steps would be valuable regardless of your perspective on whether millennials are well positioned or not. If you go with the premise or the data which suggests that there are fewer startup businesses or new business formations, and if that means that we're less entrepreneurial, which I'm not sure it does, by the way, because when we think about entrepreneurial, it means being innovative, striving, and competitive, right? And what we want is an innovative and striving and competitive economy that may not always be measured by new business formations, right? Because when I started my first business, big companies, incumbents, they weren't innovative, they were kind of slow, lethargic, and fat, right? So it was a great time to be an entrepreneur because you were picking them off, really. It was part of the strategy of my generations of entrepreneurship, right? A lot of changes were occurring, mostly in the service economy, and you had these big kind of slow incumbents, and you could start businesses based on their inefficiencies. we may be more efficient, big companies may be more efficient and innovative and competitive, which is good, and that may result in fewer startups, which may not necessarily be bad. But if you go with the premise that this data is relevant, and you wanted to get to the real root cause of how to change it, let's say we'd love to be here in a couple of years and be talking about how there's an uptick in new businesses. If there's three possibilities, right? One is it if millennials are not starting businesses at the rate we'd like them, do you think it's A, because they're not wired the right way, and there's actually something different in their wiring from a prior generation in terms of how they look at the world or just their perspective on doing what it means to be an entrepreneur? Is it structural kind of frictional costs in their lives, like financial servitude through student debt, which I think is a huge problem? Because I know when I made my decision to be an entrepreneur, I looked at the downside, and I was like, well, I'll fail, but then I'll get another job, and I can get through that period. And now that might be a whole different calculus, because my debts may be greater, and I may say it's really hard to get another job these days, so I may not want to lose the job I have. So is it these frictional structural factors, or do you think it's the opportunity set? In other words, are things changing with the way our economy is changing? Because our economy is different than it was 20, 30 years ago. That's just creating less opportunities for, I mean, there's a lot in tech if you're really talented, right? But are there less opportunities broadly in other industries? So which would you say is the biggest factor? Is it the wiring? Is it the structural frictional costs? Or is it the opportunity set?
I would say it's the second. I think it's the structural frictional cost. I think opportunities vary a lot across the country. You know, as Mark said, if you're in California, people are not, people don't think that there's any issue with getting funding, with getting the right talent, with getting people to start businesses. But a lot of it is driven by the fact that
it's always been hard to get funding.
Yes.
Right, really hard always to get funding. So I'm not sure that's really any different.
Right, but I guess all of it is becoming heightened by the recession. The fact that people are probably more hesitant to invest in a risky venture, which in an economy where failure could be penalized much more heavily than they were before. So I think I don't think it's the wiring. I think millennials are, every survey says they are sort of wired to be more entrepreneurial. They want to be starting businesses. So I suspect it's more of the second and some of the third.
For devil's advocate's sake, I will take the argument of it is the wiring, just to flesh this out. But I will challenge it on not that they aren't wired to be entrepreneurs, but more so the wiring of what people wanted when they were pursuing entrepreneurial paths is in a space right now, the context of today versus where it used to be, when you have, coming from multiple companies that have been on various, from my days at working at Microsoft to being a part of 2 startups, I've seen the spectrum of how it goes. And if I look at the way my personal friends have spun out, I have seen more entrepreneurs spinning out of the Microsofts because they're so frustrated with seeing things that they don't like and they want to change, versus in the startup community where I would say the makeup of these companies, percentage-wise, consists of more entrepreneurial individuals who are all collectively working towards that one company goal. And whether it's the challenges that companies facing, the opportunities they have, there's enough incentive for them and their entrepreneurial internal wiring is satisfied working collectively on these problems versus the need to spin out. And I think a lot of these numbers are related to growth rates, right? So I think it's always important to take a step back and think about, well, growth rate is relative to what was the base before that? And quite frankly, especially if you believe that it's a wiring argument, then you could say it's a bigger base of opportunities for people to pursue entrepreneurial ventures in ways that satisfy their needs.
So just to play with that a little bit, because again, when I started my first business, no big companies really talked about being entrepreneurial, right? They were big companies, and they weren't entrepreneurial, and you had no workplace flexibility, you followed their rules, you went to work where their offices were, you didn't work at home, you didn't have flex time, they didn't encourage a lot of new ways of thinking about things. And now all you read in the papers is, the company's got a ping pong table, and it's got all this stuff, and it's a big company, and is there something to the fact that the bigger companies actually allow people to kind of scratch their entrepreneurial itch in ways that they didn't, and they didn't kind of drive people out as much? It sounds like that happened at Microsoft,
Well, my argument was more of I would see a higher attrition of the more
Right.
entrepreneurial-minded
Right.
friends at Microsoft versus, the friends I have who've been at early stage startups and have been in explosive growth periods. Because there's just so much work to do, and they're part of writing that core. In many ways, that term entrepreneur is often thrown to corporations, but I think it exists very heavily in the startup community as well. And in aggregate, if we define entrepreneurs as just the one person who started a company, I think we're missing a lot
Right.
of the data points of the
Right,
supplement.
that's a good point.
Well, given my 3 kids who are millennials, I'd have to say it's the wiring. Definitely the wiring. Yeah. Maybe they'll get rewired at some point, but yeah. So let's turn to the boomer group. Chris, you're the optimist.
Yes, very much so.
Okay, let's hear it.
Okay, so I want to talk about boomer and entrepreneurship first within the context of a larger social movement, a grassroots movement around the country with aging baby boomers rethinking the last third of life. And I call it unretirement. You've heard encore careers, third age, next chapter. But whatever you call it, it's incorporating work into the traditional retirement years. And there are a number of reasons that this is happening. Just in case you haven't been aware, baby boomers haven't saved that well for their retirement. So working longer has an enormous implications for household finances. But there are also other reasons that are at play. Boomers are well educated. They're healthier than previous generations. And if you think about a lot of people, they develop skills, experience, knowledge over a lifetime. And fewer people want to walk away from that forever. They want to continue to tap into those skills. They want to continue to have the social environment of work. And so there's this vast experimentation and discussion going on about contract jobs, temp jobs, full-time work, part-time work, flexible work. And in the vanguard is entrepreneurship. It's one of the most exciting aspects of this rethinking of the last third of life. And boomers have a number of advantages in the entrepreneurial space. You've all heard about that we live in an economy that increasingly values human capital. We live in a knowledge economy. Well, if you think about boomers with experience and skill, they have an entrepreneurial edge in a knowledge economy. They also have, despite the problems in the housing market, and yes, capital is always hard to raise, they actually do have access to some capital. They have some home equity, and that's getting better. They have some savings. They have some family. They have friends that they can tap. And the cost of starting a business, in many cases, is not that high. You're using your home office to start your business. You're taking advantage of the internet. And you're taking advantage of what is the most valuable asset that any entrepreneur has, which is a network. And boomers have developed a network of colleagues, former colleagues, customers, the people that you made sales to. And you realize that when you think about entrepreneurship, it's talking about opportunity. There is a problem out there, and I can solve it for you. And so boomers are seeing the opportunities. They have the skill, they have the network, they have the contacts, and they may not have capital, maybe not much at home, but you may go to a former employer and say, let's have a contract and start funding their business that way. So I think there's a lot of enterprise. There's a negative force that is also going to push a lot more boomers into entrepreneurship, which is age discrimination. Age discrimination is real. And if you lose your job at 55, 56, 58, and you try and get your old job back or a comparable job the traditional way, for many people it's going to be really tough. The thing is, when you start up your own business and you're tapping into your network and you're using your capital, age discrimination is either less or it doesn't exist. There's also another form of capital I think is going to be increasingly important and underappreciated in this space, and that is intergenerational capital. There's this whole conversation about boomers versus millennials, but if you take a look, there's a lot of boomer parents. They have experience, they have skill, and they're starting businesses with their millennial children. And a lot of this is happening in the craft economy, the revival of urban manufacturing, where the boomer parent will have skill with leather, working with leather, and their child has hustle, and they have tech savvy, and creating multi-generational businesses. And this is growing in terms of having an effect. Plus, and this helps everybody, right? But the cost of technology does go down. It is a lot cheaper to start a business. And more importantly, there's an infrastructure that's being created in city after city, which is incubators and co-sharing workspaces. And we always have this image that it's a bunch of young people that are in these co-sharing workspaces and incubators. But when we went to Tech Town, it's on the edge of Wayne State University in Detroit. And it's a wonderful incubator, and about half of them are 50 and over. And this is a group of entrepreneurs who grew up in Detroit, and they want to be a part of reviving the city. And so entrepreneurship in this infrastructure, in this space, I think is being tapped by an older generation that's not being appreciated as much. And finally, a lot of people want to continue working, but boy, they're tired of being told to do more with less. And it is time to say goodbye and become the boomer boss. And it has a nice ring to it. And so I think more and more people are going to say, maybe I'll make less money, but I can work longer, I'm my own boss, and I'm going to say goodbye to that person who's been telling me what to do.
I think that sounds like the title of your next book. Yeah, Boomer Boss.
I'm going to take it.
Unless someone else steals it. Yeah. So the pessimist, Bill.
Well, you've just heard the best imaginable case for optimism. Thank you. Having said that, as Larry David might say, let us curb our enthusiasm. I learned a long time ago.
Only boomers watch that show, though.
I learned a long time ago that statistics is not the plural of anecdote. Anecdotes may inspire, but it is statistics, I believe, that genuinely instruct in a country with 350 million. So with that profession of faith, let me share a statistic with you, courtesy of the Employee Benefit Research Institute, which is pretty much the gold standard for research in these areas. Take a look at all older households. If you strip away equity in houses and the value of a defined benefit pension, the average savings in those households is $25,000. $25,000. And that raises a very interesting question. Do we really want to encourage people of relatively limited means to draw down their home equity? We've been down that road before. Do we want them to draw down their meager savings? Do we want them to go into debt at a time of life where recovery from failure is much harder? Your time horizon is different. Which brings me to my second point. That statistic was my first. As literature going back millennia has demonstrated, we change over time. There are stages of life, and those stages of life are characterized, among other things, by different perceptions of and balances between risk and security. When you're younger, you're more willing to take risk. You are less likely to have people dependent on you if you fail. And you, as I just said, you have much more time to recover if you fail. It is rational to take risk when you're young. It is less rational to take them as you get older. And using as my focus group of one, Mark Zandi, you heard it from his mouth in his introduction that his son will be willing to take risks.
I'm the anecdote.
Right, exactly. So that's my second point. My third and fourth points are a bit more structural. First, as the boomers retire, they will be heavily dependent on programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which the budget experts in the room know are soaking up more and more money every year in absolute terms as a share of GDP and certainly as a share of the federal budget. Query, what are the implications of that development over the next 20 years for the availability of capital in the economy? I find it hard to construct an argument that comes out with a positive conclusion. And finally, the retirement of the baby boom generation is correlated with and largely responsible for a very, very sharp decline in the rate of growth in the workforce on an annual basis. The rate of growth in the workforce in the years 2020 to 2030 will only be 1/3 the rate of growth in the workforce in the last decade of the 20th century. All other things being equal, that means slower growth in the economy, in the aggregate, and per capita. And everything I know about entrepreneurship tells me that slower growth means less opportunity, means fewer niches, means fewer opportunities for entrepreneurship to form. Those 4 points form the basis of my more pessimistic view of the impact of baby boomers on entrepreneurship over the next generation.
Okay, that was pessimistic.
I did my job.
Yeah. I am depressed officially. Congressman, what do you say?
So a couple of things. I think your anecdotes inspire, your data instructs, but we've got to have both. Both are critically important, I think, as we're looking at the millennial conversation as well as the boomer conversation, and that as we talk about entrepreneurship, each have unique things that can be and should be contributed if we're talking about building a strong economy. Looking at the boomers, I guess for both of you, some of the things that we hear in the halls of Congress sometimes is that the boomer generation is less engaged and involved with really long-term solutions that address the problem not just for the next 10 years maybe, but really for the next generation, the next 30 and 40 years. And in a variety of different issues, how do you solve that problem of getting this boomer generation to be invested and interested in not just what the impacts are of the rest of their lifetimes, but really for that next, whether it's their children or their grandchildren? And I guess the second half to that is, and I know a few people brought up the issue of voting, that the boomer generation obviously is far more engaged in the political process and voting, and therefore a lot of the issues, Social Security and Medicare, these issues get a lot more attention by elected officials. But I think that points to the question of if that's the concern and they're focused on this narrow subset, how do you increase that so that this constituency is focused on longer-term solutions?
Well, Congresswoman, as people in your profession often say, I'm glad you asked that question. Because it gives me an opportunity to spend 30 seconds on the proposal, the proposal I made in this context. In my view, the most significant contribution to entrepreneurship that the boomers in the aggregate will make is the capital in the right tail of the economic distribution curve that might conceivably be devoted to entrepreneurial investments. I don't particularly like the current structure of the estate tax, but given what it is, my proposal is that long-term investments in either startups or second stage venture capital firms be taxed at a lower rate at death if those investments are long-term investments. And I think that would provide some incentives for boomers in the top third of the income distribution to make more of their capital available to entrepreneurs.
I understand you guys have to leave at 1:45, is that right? Yeah, so we're running a little bit short of time. So why don't we do, I know, and I should say Congressman Panelist from Colorado was going to join us but got called away, unfortunately, so I should let everyone know that he was intending to participate. But why don't we take this opportunity, because since you have to leave, would you like to make some comments to the group before you do leave?
Sure.
Okay.
I just want to make one comment on what the panelists said, and then I'll just say things for a minute or two. I think, Chris, I think one of the reasons I'm not sure that boomers will be, I think Bill frames the contributions boomers will make to the entrepreneurship environment pretty well in terms of they'll provide capital, and I think I mean, listen, I think we'll fix the problems. I don't have a doom and gloom view that there's going to be no money for anyone in the future. I think we'll figure all that out because it is fixable, and they'll provide capital, mostly to the stock market, which is really important for entrepreneurship because 90% of entrepreneurs start a company and want to take it public. So you need a good public market. So I think boomers will play a really valuable role as mentors and those kind of things. I think the argument against boomers being really into the entrepreneurial world comes down to motivation at the end of the day because, and this I'll tie into my comments at the end, which is I think entrepreneurship is kind of a lifestyle more so than it is a great idea. Right? I know myself, I was someone who wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I didn't care what the idea was. Right? I wanted to be an entrepreneur because I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted the financial rewards associated with being an entrepreneur, and I just liked the notion of being creative and independent and building a business. And most of the entrepreneurs I've spent time with, whether it's other EY Entrepreneur of the Year winners, or I was involved for a long time in a group called YPO, which is full of entrepreneurs. There are some people who just get really into the idea and that's all that animates them. But most of them are really about I don't want to call it the lifestyle, but the approach to life that entrepreneurship gives you. And I think it's hard for boomers because you just get to a point in your life where it's just hard to do that. The things you have to do as an entrepreneur, I think about the things I did. I started my first business when I was 24. My second one when I was 29, and my third one I was 37. And now I'm 51. And I look, I have 4 kids and all this stuff. It's hard to do the stuff I did back then. And a lot of that was, you had an idea, and then you realized it wasn't going to work, and then you pivoted, and you convinced someone to do something, and you worked all the time. I think it's just hard for boomers to do that. I just think that doesn't mean they don't have a valuable role to play as mentors, advisors, people with really sage advice and experience, and most importantly, capital. But I do think it's going to be the people who have that real burning hunger to live their life a certain way that is actually going to really drive the entrepreneurial process. And I think as a country, what we need to make sure is that we're not creating, because I kind of agree, I think the opportunity sets have changed. I think the wiring is not really different, although I think there's more ways of people to satisfy the itch than starting your own business than there used to be, and that I think is net good for society. You have all these philanthropic entrepreneurial organizations, things like that didn't exist, so people can be entrepreneurs and not in the traditional way. But I do think things like student debt, overall employment opportunities, demand in the labor market, I think that's a huge issue with people going out there and taking a risk.
First of all, I just want to say thank you because I think this format is helpful not only for us, but to start these kinds of conversations because I can't tell you how many times we get to hear from really, really smart people who've got great experience, who do a great job at identifying a problem and then laying out where the end state should be, but are really short on the practical proposals saying this is how you get from A to B. So I think the more we can as a kind of conversation can work through these problems and say, hey, here's what'll work, what won't, I think it's helpful to all of us. And like I mentioned, I think really as we look at entrepreneurship, I think there's incredible strength from both communities, and that as we look at this, I think we can benefit more by recognizing that this isn't just about capital and just about our economies because there's so much more that we can actually get out of this. And I think you mentioned, Shaila, about social entrepreneurship and how as we look at the challenges today, and they're different than the challenges that we faced 10 or 20 years ago, this combination of a very practical approach with our idealism and where we would like to see ourselves and speaking from a millennial perspective, I think that this generation combined with the experience and the capital of a previous generation really gives me great hope and optimism because we see people who are very hopeful, who are very focused on solutions, results, and who are unwilling to accept the traditional social norms and constraints as constraints of challenging the status quo, asking why, and saying, okay, that may have worked then, but how can we do better? Constantly striving to achieve that, not only in business, but in politics, in our communities, in education, and healthcare, and each of these different factors. And like John said, it really is about an entrepreneurial spirit that we can apply to each of the things that we do And that's where I see hope, and that's what gets me excited about doing what we're doing.
Okay, now I feel a lot better. Yeah, right. Thank you, Congresswoman. That was very kind. Congressman, thank you so much for participating in this and joining. I know you have to get back to work. So the one thing I wonder about on the millennial side, and maybe it's on the boomers a little bit as well, but you know, I am a business person at heart. I have 170 employees working for me in different parts of the world. And the one thing I've noticed about, and I have all age groups, and I've hired a lot of millennials. And the one thing I've noticed about millennials is that, and I'm sorry, this isn't really statistics, this is anecdote, because there is no statistics here, this is my experience, that millennials are much more footloose than their parents, right, than the boomers. Right. Even, I think, when, maybe because of lack of opportunity, but maybe partly attitude, change in the social contract between employers and employees. I don't know, lots of different. But the upshot of that is that business people then ask themselves, well, should I really train these folks? Because if I do, all I'm doing is going to lower my retention rates, raise my turnover, and it's just not going to pay off. You know, my return to investment is lower. What do you think about that? Is that a problem, and how do we address that problem if you do?
I think the issue, and the study after study has shown that, of course, the employer is making that investment, and then there's a huge cost to it. But there is a payoff in terms of productivity, in terms of performance, in terms of, you know, they do tend to perform better on the job. They do tend to, so firm productivity has been shown to go up. So I think there are payoffs, and of course, you know, as with any employee, I don't think it's simply, you know, millennials or we don't. The economy is constantly changing, and I think generation after generation is becoming more of a job hopper than the previous generation. So I think there's always the cost-benefit analysis of, you know, do I need to make these investments, and is it going to pay off for me, or should I? But at the end of the day, they are working for you, and you want them to be highly productive. So you know, I do think that there is a payoff in the long run, and I think that's why we do see more and more employers wanting to make these kind of investments. But
Chris, you have something to say?
Well, but I also think it's a very healthy development. I mean, Business Week magazine in 1986 did their cover story, The End of Corporate Loyalty. And that was a period of time when blue-collar companies, manufacturing companies, blue-collar workers would just lay off whole divisions. And now it's just part of management's toolkit. And so as a generation has grown up and sees what happens to their parents. And a lot of their parents lost their job, not because they were bad at doing their job or because they you know, some sort of mistake, but just simply, well, you're no longer as profitable. We're going to move our resources over here. You're out of a job. And the other thing is, I think it's also part of this, why longer term optimistic about the millennials and in entrepreneurship. You know, dating myself, when I graduated from college, I mean, people kind of like, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to go in the private sector, I'm going to go into government. There are a few people over here that this entrepreneurship thing was over there. And now there's much more fluidity. People aren't saying, I'm going to do this. And I think this is also part of it. You might be doing statistics for you, and then you might shift to a government agency for a while, and then you're going to go to a nonprofit. And so I think it's part of this is an optimistic shift in the workforce. And it also means in the end, companies are going to have to work harder to keep their workers. And that's a healthy development.
Shalini, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just think there's something really ironic in this whole problem, because if you look back historically when people were loyal to their companies, if you look at where most good talent coming out of school went, it was typically to large firms, banks, consulting firms, right? And if you look at the way those companies structure the first 2 years on the job for the entry-level talent, they invest heavily in training and development programs. What originally the goal was they'd stick around. What was funny was, even when I graduated in 2004, I entered Microsoft in a leadership development program, very much like a very capital-intensive program. They were taking big bets on identifying a handful of people they thought would stick around. What's funny is, I think it was a very lagged model that they did not have internally, with their own HR analytics, had ever done the ROI of the effectiveness of that spend. Again, anecdotally of our cohort, significant portion left after that group. And I think what's funny, if you think about the amplification of that, is if you believe that a large portion, especially the older half of the millennial talent, a significant portion of them went through these kind of opportunities, and then the younger half hasn't. In many ways, these large companies, these corporations, banks have been subsidizing the cost of training and preparing our entry-level talent. And now you finally have companies being like, wait, this isn't effective for us. And yet there's a fundamental hole left in what do we do and how do we get that. And I'm a big optimistic believer. It's what we're trying to do with Institute, creating programs that effectively challenge and tackle that.
Great. Well, let's thank our panelists. Thank you, guys.